Good evening and welcome to Face to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh Eliatambi. I have with me a very special guest, Professor David C. Engerman, who is a historian at Yale University, a very prestigious university indeed. Good evening and welcome to Sri Lanka and welcome to the show, Professor.
Good evening. It's great to be here.
Right. This is not your first visit to Sri Lanka, but you said the last time you were here was in 1991.
That was the first time. I've been here a couple times since, but yes, I was in 1991 as visiting a friend of mine, an American friend who was working in Matale.
Right. I hope Sri Lanka has changed for the better since that time.
Dramatically so.
Wonderful. Now, as a historian, Professor, let's talk about this period in history, which is a very exciting and an even more alarming period in global history, because we have the Middle East crisis and we have other issues around the world as well. But what do you make of the Middle East situation, Professor, in a historical context? How will history view this particular period, this particular war?
Well, I think there are elements of continuity, that this in some ways is not a new story. Iranian-U.S. enmity dates back to the Islamic Revolution in 1978. That, in turn, revolution was fed by the U.S. both installing and supporting a kind of despotic Shah, the despotic Shah of Iran. And then, I mean, the prompting for the revolution itself was when it took in the Shah for medical treatment into the U.S. So lots of this are of long standing. These issues, and some of these issues actually even predate that. So it's not entirely unfamiliar. I think what we're seeing now is novel in the sense that we're seeing a kind of, I would say, an unplanned escalation. It's not an accidental one, obviously. The U.S. president authorized the airstrikes, but it's not planned in the sense it's not exactly clear what the aims were when it went in. We've heard a kind of variety of different possibilities. And there's no, I would say, grand strategy, no plan to set goals and seek to achieve them. So it's not entirely clear what it will take to get out, get the U.S. To do its part in calming the current situation.
Well, that's one of the peculiar things about this war, isn't it? There doesn't seem to be a goal, a strategy. There is, of course, the stated goal of preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, but how to set about doing that and whether this is an effective methodology or strategy at all is up in the air. So it seems to have been, well, let's bomb them first and then figure out if that works, sort of nonsensical strategy. And this is very peculiar, because when you go to war with a large nation, and Iran is a large nation with, I believe, more than 90 million people, you usually have a plan, a strategy. You know you're going to wage war for 6 months or whatever, and these are your objectives. So this seems a peculiar type of war, isn't it?
It's peculiar indeed. There's no real goal that I can discern, and no kind of stable one. The one thing I would observe is, if for those diplomats who've been making the case that diplomacy is the best way to keep Iran, to limit Iran's nuclear threat, looks like they could be getting the winning side of that argument, because it turned out that the military force, at the extent to which it's gone so far, which is incredibly high, I mean 13,000 missile or drone attacks or more, has not achieved what the Iran nuclear agreement that Trump ripped up has not achieved what that has. So I think if the choice is between the Department of War and Department of Defense, Department of Defense and Department of State, so far I'd say the Department of State seems to be winning. If the goal is regime change, I think it's hard to say that the U.S. should feel free to install a new regime everywhere it goes, although it's not. I think it's also clear that the current Iranian regime is not a source of peace, both internally or externally. I'm not sure that regime change seems to be on the table either. It sounds like if we believe the admissions of the president, that some of the people they'd lined up to be successors, it turns out they were killed in the initial onslaught. So another sign of like the lack of planning at any elementary level.
Diplomacy is usually what you try first. Why go to war and risk it all if you can achieve your goals diplomatically? But what we are seeing in this day and age, this era, we've seen Russia going to war and not getting very far in Ukraine. And it's been several years and hundreds of thousands of deaths, and there's no end in sight there. And then we see the United States following a similar strategy in the Middle East. What is the problem here? Is it a lack of knowledge of statesmanship?
I think it's a lack of interest in statesmanship more than a lack of knowledge of statesmanship. I would make one important distinction between the two wars, and I do not say this as a kind of defense of the United States, but the wars are being waged differently. It's a ground war. There's the drones and the missiles are clearly a part of it, but the goal, there is at least a goal for Putin. It's a goal that is basically destroying the independence of Ukraine, but it is a goal, and it is being fought literally on the ground. Whereas so far the U.S. Has maintained it as just a kind of a high-tech war from a distance with onslaughts of missiles. So I don't know that that's better or worse, but I do think there are different tactics at play. I think the lack of interest in diplomacy doesn't come necessarily just from failures of diplomacy. I think the Iran nuclear agreement was a success. It has at least prevented, while it was in force, the steps toward building a bomb. It relies to some degree on a degree of trust that Trump has not exhibited for any other country, and certainly not for Iran.
Trump's attitude towards the rest of the world really is an enigma to me. He all of a sudden said, "Oh, tariffs on the entire world," and in some cases it was as high as 100% or more. The case of China, for example, other countries it was 15 or 20%. And there was no rhyme or reason for it, and it was economists were aghast at the lack of logic in it. So America's positioning in the world certainly seems to have suffered by this kind of thoughtless strategy.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to really defend the tariff efforts, which were just in part because it's not clear the tariffs would work, and in part just for the shambolic way in which they were announced one day on Twitter, retracted the next, revised 2 days later. Someone comes and gives a nice performance for Trump, and then the tariffs go down. Aside from all of that part, it's not even clear that it would have achieved the goals. I actually see the tariffs as part of something that is not just an American phenomenon, but a rise of a kind of populist right that is less interested in engaging with the rest of the world. And we see the emergence of populist right parties, most recently in the UK, where Reform UK has its strongest standing ever. AfD in Germany, National Rally in France, up until this year, Orban in Hungary. debatably current government in India, right? We're seeing this is a global phenomenon, and I think part of that is a response to kind of the globalization enthusiasms that lasted for maybe the 1990s, and well into the 21st century, where the winners and losers of globalization, those who are not gaining from it, are susceptible to these enthusiasms for a kind of populist ruler who is just less interested in engaging with the rest of the world and doesn't see it as part of their national benefit.
Now, Professor, the spheres of trade, diplomacy, politics, war, all of these are interlinked. They are not separate. You don't have your political objectives in a region are not entirely independent or separate from your trade issues, your trade relations with that region, and so on. In the past, the State Department has had a lot of influence over American presidents. But in the case of this president, it almost appears that the State Department has no influence whatsoever, and he's doing whatever he feels a region or a country needs. It's his view rather than the views of the hundreds of diplomats at the State Department.
Yeah, I think that's right. This isn't unprecedented. I think Henry Kissinger, while working in the Nixon administration, had no use for the State Department and took a kind of glee in humiliating the Secretary of State for a number of years, until actually he was kind of pressured into becoming Secretary of State in addition to serving as National Security Advisor. So it's not I think the role of the State Department and the White House can vary from administration to administration. I think in the George W. Bush years, it wasn't, even in spite of its strong leaders, as Secretary of State, it was not at the center of policymaking. But we're seeing this rather extraordinary lack of expertise and trust in expertise. So at least in the Nixon case, Nixon and Kissinger, and the Bush case, there are people in the White House whose job is to serve the president, who are knowledgeable in one region or another. Where I think those have been completely sidelined. Any kind of expertise is now passé in Washington.
Does this have any connection to Donald Trump's contempt for learning and academia? Because we see Trump, he's gone after universities like Harvard and many other universities, reduced their funding, and so on. Is there a link with his contempt for expertise and academia?
Yeah, I think there are two issues going on there. One is a contempt for expertise. We're also seeing that dramatically in the reduction of funding for science, which seems to me just a completely short-sighted strategy. I think some of what's going on with the universities is one of the most powerful instincts right now in the White House is pure animus. So not only has he attacked Harvard, he also attacked his alma mater, where he went to University of Pennsylvania. I think he identifies elite American higher education as not representing the interests of the full population, and certainly not representing the values that he purports to hold. And there is a way in which he's right, that the universities in the United States do tilt toward the liberal, especially in my corner of it in the humanities, but also, in undergraduate education more generally. And I think, there are some who would argue, I don't know that I'd hold this position, that there was a need to sort of rebalance the kinds of activities and politics of American universities. But animus and direct attack seems hardly the best way. I think the charges of anti-Semitism, there were some regrettable moments in American higher education regarding the protests after October 2023. But it's been, to use his favorite word, weaponized. Really, the issue has nothing to do with protecting Jewish students and faculty in the United States, in American universities. It seems clearly just a weapon that he can wield against elite higher education in particular. So I think there are two things going on in these attacks, but a kind of contempt for expertise is clearly one of them.
But if any leader in any nation has such contempt for his experts in different fields, whether it's trade or diplomacy or whatever, he's heading for disaster, isn't he? And
well,
taking the world with it.
As one who, I would never call myself the expert in something, but as one who spends a lot of time around really deep knowledge and deep expertise and admire it greatly, it's hard not to take this a little personally. And I think it is a very short-sighted strategy. I think if he had sort of gamed out with generals or with former generals or with some military group about how the war in Iran would go, he would not have been surprised by Iranian actions in the Strait of Hormuz. I don't mean to endorse them, but I would say that they were an effective response to the circumstances that they were in, and I would say an utterly predictable one at that.
Oh, absolutely. Now let's get back to diplomacy. The Pakistanis have been working very hard to try to resolve this situation, but their influence is clearly limited. But what about other major players? For example, China, which does depend on Middle Eastern oil in a huge way, but we don't see the Chinese government or the Chinese president really getting out there and saying, okay, this war absolutely needs to stop, or it's not speaking very decisively.
I don't know. I don't think it's indecisive so much as the old adage that when your foe is busy injuring themselves, why should you get involved, right? The U.S. military power, U.S. standing in the world has been further diminished by just the events since February 28th. Why would China want to bail out the U.S. in that situation? I think one thing about the Chinese government, in part because it is so, the role of popular opinion is so limited, that it can play a long game. And in the long game, it's not about the price of oil right now. It's about the standing of the United States and the power of the United States in the world.
Well, China always plays the long game, don't they? They plan decades ahead, so they must have by now worked out the different situations and how this could end and what that would mean to the world and to China itself.
I would imagine so, and it is a little bit of a surprise. You'd think, given the higher prices they're paying for oil and how much they need to import, they'd need to that there would be benefit for them to engage. But I think if you look at the long game, it's the story turns out differently.
Right. And what about India? Now, again, India was and is in the midst of a huge economic boom, but that could be dampened by this global economic crisis. So how should the Modi government be reacting to all this? They've been pretty conservative and pretty quiet as well over the last few months.
That's a tough question. I think India does not, to use Trump's favorite phrase, does not have a lot of cards to play in this. They rely on natural gas and oil imports to supplement what they produce domestically. And so they are, their economy is under particular threat, as is the economy, as are the economies of much of the rest of the world. But its ability to project military power in that particular sphere are limited. Its willingness to Modi's unwillingness to kowtow to Trump, which I think is playing a role in this, whereas Pakistanis seem pretty happy to fawn over Trump. This is actually an old tradition. I was looking at some documents from the 1960s when Field Marshal Ayub Khan proudly declared Pakistan America's most allied ally because it belonged to multiple regional treaties. So it's also being marginalized, but it has at least a better claim, an easier claim, for instance, to connect with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Although, as you say, I think the influence of Pakistan was never large and is actually diminishing.
Right. And before we go to a break, my final question is, what about Putin? What about Russia? Is Putin also sitting back and enjoying watching Trump bloodying his own nose?
I imagine he's enjoying that, but he has to then look over the bloodshed in Ukraine, for which he is more than any single person responsible, and the growing kind of conundrum in Ukraine. Now, of course, the current phase of the conflict started in February 2022, but it actually goes back to 2014 when, if you remember, the quote-unquote little green men, the Russian special forces in Crimea, and so on, that this has been a kind of issue of longstanding. Putin seems willing to pay almost any price to gain Ukraine. Is not even in spite of the battlefield limits. It's very, very, very slow and bloody advances. Seems unwilling to rethink their aims or their strategies.
Again, it appears to be a huge miscalculation on the part of Putin, as we see with Trump, that he expected the war in the Ukraine to be a walkover, to be over very soon, but it has proved anything but.
Yeah, Putin has a purpose, and has an aim. I don't like the aim, which is basically to neuter Ukraine, if not take it over completely. But there is at least an aim behind that, and the strategy has not worked. I think it's very easy to underestimate an enemy, especially since in the early part of the war, what really sustained it was the kind of resolve of the Ukrainian people, which he apparently did not factor in to the calculations at all. But it also speaks to what happens when you hire only people who are there to serve you and agree with you. Yes men and yes women, rather than people who will tell things as they really are. And that might have helped us avoid both of these conflicts if the leaders were getting really candid advice and actually taking it on board.
Absolutely. We need to take a short commercial break right now. I'm in conversation with Professor David C. Engerman. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this.
The FIFA Football World Cup 2020.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am in conversation with Professor David C. Engerman, who is a historian at Yale University. Professor Engerman is, of course, a noted scholar who has written several books. His latest one is titled Apostles of Development, Six Economists and the World They Made. Now, Professor, this is a very, very interesting book because you're talking about economists whom you personally knew and the impact that they had. And would you like to tell us about them and about your book?
I'd be happy to. Apostles of Development is a history of international development, but it's told through the lives and work of six economists who all studied together at Cambridge in the 1950s. All of them are South Asian. Among the Indians are the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, the former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and the well-known international economist in the U.S., Jagdish Bhagwati. Also in that number are Mahbub ul Haq, a Pakistani who invented the Human Development Index, which is still widely used today. Raman Soban, who worked tirelessly for Bangladeshi independence and served in the government immediately after 1971. And of course, Lal Jayawardena, who was a leading economic advisor and diplomat in Sri Lanka until his untimely death in 2004.
Right. And tell us about what you've written about Dr. Lal Jayawardena in this book, because I'm sure many of our viewers remember Dr. Lal Jayawardena. I certainly do, having interviewed him many years ago. Tell us about his impact, in your opinion.
So the moment I would look to his impact, he had a long and varied career, but the moments I'm most interested in are in the early 1970s when he represented Sri Lanka in an IMF committee that was trying to navigate a new international economic order. And he worked tirelessly, actually, to try and initiate reforms both to the IMF itself and to the financial system that would improve the odds and the possibilities for poor countries in the what was then called the Third World to gain in prosperity and independence. The committee he was on, and it started in 1972, ran for a couple of years, produced a report that's about 200 pages, and 5 of them document the points of agreement, and the other 195 document the points of disagreement. I'm reminded in this that it was in his assessment of the work of that committee. He says, every time someone asks for something for the Third World, all they get is a committee. And they got a committee that didn't work. His other notable moments actually in the 1970s were at home, where he worked for Bandar Naika in the Planning Commission and was one of the key figures in the first Sri Lankan 5-year plan. And then when the government changed, he worked for Finance Minister Rani Demel on these major liberalizing reforms in 1977. So if we see over the global south over decades a shift from planning to markets, in Sri Lanka's case and in Dr. Jayawardena's himself, it happened in about 5 years, from a big plan to a liberalizing program that was essentially a foreshadowing of what came to be called structural adjustment.
Right. And what about the other 5 scholars who you have included in your book?
So they all did different things. And one of the things I liked about having this group is they actually disagreed with each other, often vehemently. And it's very easy from the perspective of the United States or in Europe to imagine that there's a third world angle on economic development. But in fact, they're defined as much by their differences as they are by their similarities and by the fact that they were together at Cambridge. So two of them were academics, primarily academics, Professor Amartya Sen, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, who disagreed very publicly, actually, about India's economic past and its future, and books that each of them wrote a kind of co-authored book in 2013 that was basically strongly at odds with each other. Mahbub al-Haq and Rehman Sobhan actually had pitched battles in economic planning in Pakistan over the disparity between East and West Pakistan, the kind of economic issue that stood at the heart of Bangladeshi calls for autonomy, or East Pakistani calls for autonomy, and eventually independence.
Right. To give our viewers a little bit of a snapshot on Professor David Engerman, Professor Engerman he's done his PhD from Berkeley, the University of California at Berkeley, and before that a master's at Rutgers University and a bachelor's at Swarthmore University, and he has written 4 books. So this was the 4th that we just spoke about. But the 3rd book sounds very interesting as well. The Price of Aid, the Economic Cold War in India. Could you tell us about that one?
So I was very interested. My training at Berkeley was in both American history and Soviet history, not actually in South Asian history at all. But India turned out to be a very fortuitous place to do something I wanted to do, which was to look at American-Soviet aid competition. And it's a book that really changed the way I think about history, the course of writing it. I started with the notion that India was choosing between an American model and a Soviet model. But what I saw when I started looking in the archives, and I worked in archives both in India, in the Soviet Union, and in the United States, was that would come as no surprise to people here. But again, coming from the U.S., it's easy to see the Cold War as a kind of superpower conflict in which everyone else played supporting roles. That there are robust and, in fact, even venomous disagreements about Indian economic policy and its best path forward from the 1950s onward, and that the Cold War, the involvement of the United States and Soviet Union was in the context of these disagreements. And so those economists in India who were more inclined to less regulated markets, more inclined to engagement in the global flow of commerce, not surprisingly, looked to the United States to find both rhetorical and material support. And those interested in heavy industry, more interested in a heavier role for government in the economy, more interested in central planning, not surprising that they looked to the Soviet Union. So it reversed the vision that I started with. And I see the United States and the Soviet Union being called in by various Indian economists in order to support the programs and the visions that they had for India's economic future.
Now, Professor, given your expertise in both American history and Soviet history in, well, I wouldn't call it contemporary times, but certainly the 20th century, what do you see as being the major difference in the world back when we had the 2 superpowers, the United States heading the West, and of course the Soviet Union leading the Warsaw Pact. What's the major difference between that era and this era that we are living through now, where the US is perhaps the sole superpower, but you have some up-and-coming major powers like China, India, and of course Russia is still very much evident. What's the major difference in this?
I think one issue about what defined the Cold War was that there was no corner of the world that was not of interest. There was no safety from Cold War, from becoming a Cold War battleground. And that's in part because the conflict was ideological in nature. Each side was determined to demonstrate that the vision they held was the future for the world, and actually willing to put a great deal of money and at times military commitment behind that. I think one of the things that moment disguised actually was there were two superpowers, but in economic terms, one was more super than the other. And I do not in any way want to come off as a kind of an American patriot, but it turns out that the American economy was substantially larger than the Soviet one in such a way that it actually helped bring about the demise of the Soviet Union. And Russia, post-Soviet Russia, finds itself more of a regional power than a global one. Its global pretensions, its global interests have shrunk dramatically, as have its ability to maintain them. In principle, you could say that the U.S.-China conflict is an ideological conflict. It still is the People's Republic of China. There still is a Communist Party. But it's hard to see it operating in that way when it seems to be spending a lot of its time and energy beating the United States at its own capitalist games.
Absolutely. Now, Professor, you are here in Sri Lanka this time for a workshop at the ICES, the International Center for Ethnic Studies, that took place last week. And it's for scholars based in the South Asian region. What's that all about? Tell us, this sounds very interesting.
So I've been involved with this. It's called the Yale Modern South Asia Workshop. I think this is our 18th meeting. We started doing it mostly in North America, but decided that we really wanted to reach to a different kind of population of young scholars. And so it's open to scholars who are, usually it's 2 years, either 2 years from receiving their PhD or have received their PhD within the last 2 or 3 years. And to bring them together to help improve their work, to talk about how to advance in the field professionally, how to publish academic articles, how to apply for fellowships and jobs, all of this sort of thing. And what's really remarkable about the event is that we really aim to bring in scholars from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from India, and from Sri Lanka all together, and to see them interacting with each other, to see them learning from each other, to see our own engagements with them, really gives us, me and I think I would speak for the other organizers as well, a real sense of pride and hope for the next generation of South Asian academics who are both doing fascinating work, but are really interested in building connections across the region. We're especially grateful to be able to host it in Colombo in general, at the ICES in particular, because that's one of our best venues for bringing in scholars. Thanks to the divisions within South Asia, the best opportunity to bring scholars from across these divided lines together literally in the same room for 2 days.
Wonderful. We spoke about 2 of your books, but let's talk about your first and second books, which I'm not that familiar with.
So they're a little bit, as my kids would say, a little bit niche, but I am an academic, and that's how it goes. They're both, broadly speaking, about America's Russia expertise. The first one was because there was no organized Russia expertise in the United States before World War II. It was a bunch of people, actually one of the professors who was involved in it called "The only people who are interested in Russia are a bunch of freaks and nuts," I think was his phrase. He included himself in that. Journalists, diplomats, and scholars who really knew Russian, who knew Russia well. So that was my first book. It was my dissertation at Berkeley, as you'd mentioned. My second book was a sort of volume 2 to that, but in some ways a very different book. It looked at the enterprise of Soviet studies, or Sovietology, as both an intellectual and a political activity. The United States government was very interested in expanding Russia expertise, in part because they wanted Russian speakers to go into the State Department, to go into the intelligence agencies, etc. But but they were willing to play the long game in this, I guess, and look more broadly at building that expertise. And so they built up expertise in Russian literature. They built up an expertise in Russian history as well. And so it's a history of an academic enterprise, and one that was closely tied to policy interests.
Right. Interesting books indeed. And we're almost out of time, but let me ask you for your opinion on this period in history that we are going through right now, Professor. We have had dark periods in human history. Much of the first half of the 20th century, with 2 world wars and perhaps about 100 million people dead worldwide in those 2 world wars. So that was a particularly dark period. And then even the rest of the 20th century was quite bloody in various parts of the world, such as Cambodia and Vietnam and so on. How do you see this period of history that we are going through right now, which is, after all, the new millennium, which is now 26 years old, but is it any better than the 20th century?
I find it very hard to pick my favorite period of history, because all of them have their dark moments and all of them simultaneously have their bright spots. One of the things I would identify as distinctive in this period, and perhaps a cause of some of the conflict, is the rise of powers like India, Brazil, who had for decades and even before been either colonized or quite poor, who did not have much voice in global affairs, taking that voice. Their economies are thriving, better, some years better than others. This year probably not a good one thanks to oil prices, but the economies are growing and thriving. The population is much better off, much better educated than in prior generations. And so I think part of this is accommodating a world that is not just centered around Europe as it was in the colonial period, or around the kind of Washington-Moscow nexus. I don't think it's going to be centered around a Beijing U.S. or Beijing-Moscow network either. But to examine to see what a truly multipolar world looks like, we can see that in the effects of the Iranian tactics in response to the United States, where in spite of the U.S. sort of on paper extraordinary military supremacy, it is not sufficient in and of itself to bring about the changes that the United States has sought. So I think that's one of the big issues. That's a kind of frame it globally, is to imagine a world that's not just with different powers, but different kinds of powers. And the other, I think, is some of the aftershock. I would see them as the aftershocks of globalization, the rise of right-wing populism. And that we see it in its perhaps most dangerous form in the United States. But the right-wing parties are gaining ground all across Europe, Eastern, West Europe, and Western. Debatably, you can see elements of this in Modi and BJP role in India. And I think this is a global phenomenon. It is not the export of Trumpism, although Trump has at various moments tried. Bolsonaro represents that in Brazil. But I think that's another thing that is salient as the world is changing. So on the one hand, it's trying to imagine a new geopolitical structure, and the other, a geoeconomic structure.
And on that note, I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks indeed to Professor David C. Engerman, historian at Yale University. Thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.